The Morung Lecture is the first in a long time, in Dimapur at least. The last that we had was in Faisal Ali College, but in Dimapur I think we're having it after a year perhaps. But we hope that we would be able to do it more frequently, because eventually Morung Lecture is an idea, as much as Morung Express is an idea to reimagine, to re-articulate knowledge, knowledge, and also in terms of change and power. And let me put it that way, is to re-articulate and reimagine power, change, and knowledge. And it's only through these interactions of going back and forth that perhaps new knowledge would also emerge. I want to thank the Sinai Ministry for partnering with us. And so by partnering with Sinai Ministry and the Lighthouse Church, we are able to use this space. And not just in terms of using this space, but really even the idea of how do we make sanctuaries like this safe spaces. And I think in the Naga context, we really need safe spaces where people feel safe to be able to ask questions, difficult questions, but also in terms of the safe space where we can relate in a different way, in a way that perhaps is liberating in that sense. Just to add to some points that Aheli shared, I think in the last few years, especially post-COVID, the space for news, information has really changed. And if I may use the word, it has been more democratized. I think the space for news and information is democratizing to the extent that perhaps, now is the space is so fluid that we're not able at times to distinguish between what is information and what is news. It's so fast changing. The forms are changing, and not just the forms, the substance itself is changing. And through these changes, we see society is also changing. And I would say in the Naga context, I think, in many ways, especially post-COVID, post-lockdown, with the democratization of news agencies, our society is also changing. But within this change, we need to also explore, we also need to be critical in terms of what kind of change is being induced in our context. Because not everything, not all information is news, and not, I think some of the questions that were asked were pertinent to that question. And I think this is something for the media fraternity. Today's lecture makes me even realize even more that we need greater interaction between the media fraternity and civil society and educational institutions and scholars and members of the public. Because the media is going to become even more and more influential in impacting how people think. And not just in terms of how people think, but in terms of the language that is emerging. And I would like to say, I think in our context, the language itself is changing to such an exchange. Not just the spoken language, but also the language in which ideas and thoughts are being communicated. And I don't think we have spent enough time in this area of public interest. So friends, yes, I think forms are changing, but so is the substance. And perhaps this lecture emphasizes the need for us just to sit back and just to take a step back and to reflect in the way that Aheli has done. And perhaps her studies, getting out of the situation, enables that, and she brings that wisdom and that knowledge and is gracious enough to share it with us so that we too can reflect with her and think with her. Just a few thoughts on terrains of struggle. Being part of this paper, we are able to see society in a different way. We are participating with society, with the people, in a different way, because we have to be, as Aheli said, inside as well as outside. So we are transversing those two worlds. And in the process, we see this encounter between the struggle for power on one hand, and the pursuit of rights on the other hand. On one hand, we see this immense push for power. And on the other hand, we see this struggle for rights. And sometimes, these seem like opposing forces. And they have become opposing forces in many ways in the Naga context. They're not complementing each other. I think this is going to be one of the challenges of the times to come. The pursuit for power on one hand, and the struggle for rights. Because perhaps we as a people have not yet fully interrogated the question of power. And so when this pursuit of power and the struggle of rights is engaging, the people who the powers that we claim are indispensable actually become expendable. All agencies of power will say, without the people, wherefore the people? The people are indispensable. But in this struggle for power and the pursuit for rights, the people become expendable. And so when we are here as part of the press fraternity, we are able to see more and more clearly how the people are becoming expendable, even though the leaders will say that they are indispensable. And also partly because questions of democracy have been reduced to an event. And so we don't see participation, we don't see, a back and forth dialogue. And these are observations that I would say we are able to arrive at. And in the process, the sense of powerlessness is quite evident. The sense of powerlessness is quite evident to the extent that people start obeying in advance. That people are already obeying in advance even before your obedience is sought. It's precisely because of this encounter between the struggle of for power and the pursuit of rights. And because the people, the majority, have become expendable, and there is a sense of powerlessness that we are now obeying in advance. Almost giving up the sense of ownership, a resignation. But Aheli talks about the need to take ownership, right? The need to be able to tell your own stories. And perhaps that is something we need to explore together. And perhaps that is something that the journalistic fraternity would emphasize more. As storytellers, to be able to tell stories where people themselves are taking ownership over those stories. And through this emerging trend of obeying in advance, it also means that there is lack of critical thinking. And not just lack of critical thinking, the pace of assimilation is going quite fast. The pace in which we are being assimilated is increasing rapidly to the extent that we are being deculturalized. To the extent that we are being deculturalized. And within this ecology of being deculturalized and assimilated, development becomes what Sanjoy in the last lecture said, the paracetamol. The development has now become the paracetamol for all illnesses. Irrespective of what your illness is, you are given a paracetamol. Development as paracetamol. And it is projected as the only solution for everything. No matter what sickness I may have. This seems to be the trend in which the Naga society is now living in, where development has become the paracetamol, irrespective of what the illness is. And so the giver of paracetamol and the user of paracetamol, or aspirin, let me put it that way, we have become addicted to that. And we don't look for any other solutions beyond that paradigm. And it is within this context, I feel that the question of Naga journalism becomes imperative. It becomes imperative. Because within this, because paracetamol, development has, is being, used as a medicine for all illnesses, we see that there is also, yes, materialism. Yes, there have also been some form of, material growth. But the effect of that is there is moral poverty. And along with that moral poverty is the lack of moral courage. The courage to question. The courage to intervene. The courage to speak the truth. The courage to respect. The courage to be in solidarity with one another. And so Aheli's lecture within this socio-political conditions in which we live becomes even more acute, becomes even more fundamental and important. I think that for us to improve the quality of news, there must be more engagement of society. It's quite true that in today's context, news has become virtually free. You just have to go to, various channels and sites and you get information. But here is not about news, it's about journalism as well. And journalism as agents of reimagining, re-articulating power, change, and knowledge. So I would encourage us, all of us, to engage more with journalists, with the press fraternity. Yes, even ask them difficult questions. There has to be some degree of self-criticism as well. And in the Naga context, it's very easy to become complacent because we're all obeying in advance, right? So it's very easy. I think, so that engagement, I think, is missing. The journalists in the Naga context, the press fraternity is so important, but don't see that engagement, that back and forth engagement with institutions, with governments, with civil society. But every time you need to say something to the people, you require the press in one form or the other. But I think that relationship we have to critique. That relationship has to go beyond just being utilized in that sense. You can understand what I'm saying. We have to create a relationship of respect between the press fraternity and the public at large. And for me, that is my point, the point I take from Aheli's lecture. is to really create that space through this critical engagement by challenging boundaries. The boundaries that we have already set. It needs to be challenged.